This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in France, where President Emmanuel Macron has won a second five-year term, triumphing over far-right challenger Marine Le Pen, who conceded defeat Sunday. Macron is the first French president since 2002 to be reelected. He won some 58% of the vote, while Le Pen garnered about 42%. Macron's victory was much narrower than in 2017, when he beat Le Pen with over 66% of the vote, pointing to the growing support in recent years for Le Pen's openly anti-immigrant and Islamophobic platform, as well as disappointment over Macron's centrist neoliberal agenda and his own backing of harsh anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim policies. In his victory address Sunday, Macron vowed to reach out to supporters of Le Pen.
Après 5 années de transformation, d'heures heureuses.
After 5 years of transformation, both happy and difficult, and exceptional crisis,
Du 24 avril 2022,
on this day, April 24th, 2022, a majority of us have chosen to trust me to lead our republic for the next 5 years.
Je pense aussi à tous nos compatriotes qui se sont abstenus.
I also think of all of our compatriots who abstained from voting. Their silence signified a refusal to choose, to which we must also respond.
Je pense enfin.
Finally, I think of those who voted for Madame Le Pen, who I know is disappointed this evening.
Ne sifflez personne.
No, don't boo anyone. From the beginning, I asked you never to boo.
Parce que, dès à présent,
Because I am no longer the candidate of a party, but the president of everyone.
mais le président de toutes et tous. Et je sais que pour nombre de nos compatriotes,
I know that for many of our compatriots who chose the extreme right today,
la colère et les
their anger and disagreements which led them to vote for this project must also find a response.
réponses. Ce sera
And that will be my responsibility and that of those around me.
This comes as more than a quarter of French voters abstained, with many saying they opposed both candidates. This was Le Pen's third attempt at the presidency. She said Sunday's results were evidence of dissatisfaction with Macron.
Un grand vent de liberté aurait pu se lever sur le pays.
A great breeze of liberty could have arisen in the country. The results of the vote, which I respect, wanted otherwise. Despite 2 weeks of disloyal, brutal, and violent methods, similar to what the French are suffering every day, the ideas that we represent is reaching its peak on the night of the second round of the presidential election. With more than 43% of the votes, tonight's results represents, in itself, a shining victory.
Les Français manifestent ce soir le souhait d'un contre-pouvoir fort.
The French are showing tonight a wish for a strong counterpower against that of Emmanuel Macron, for an opposition that will continue to defend and protect them in the face of the degradation of their purchasing power, attacks on liberty, putting into question our public service and our social system, Emmanuel Macron's proposition to push the retirement age, insecurity, and anarchic immigration, and the laxity of the courts.
Well, for more on the French presidential election, we're joined in Paris by journalist Cole Stangler. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Cole. Can you start off by just reacting to the re-election of Macron, but the increasing number of votes that Le Pen has gotten over the years, this her third defeat?
Absolutely. So if you look at sort of the numbers, 17 percentage points seems like a pretty comfortable margin of victory. And people were talking about maybe this election in France looking something like the Brexit vote, like the Trump vote in 2016. Clearly wasn't the case. But if you kind of look beneath the surface, the 17 percentage point margin of Macron isn't really as comfortable of a margin as it looks. For one, as we were talking about, as you were mentioning, the far right is on the march here in France, both in terms of the brute electoral numbers they're getting in elections. If you compare the vote that Le Pen got yesterday with 2017, Macron's margin of victory was cut in half. It was 10 million votes in 2017. It's now was 5 million votes. They're progressing electorally. They're also progressing in the sort of broader battle of ideas. If you tune into the media in France, far-right ideas tend to dominate the public debate, where we're talking all the time about immigration, about Islamism, about insecurity. So the far-right is clearly on the advance here, and I think that's one of the big takeaways. You have 41% of the French population that went out and voted for somebody who wants to cut off housing, cut off social housing for immigrants, for foreigners, wants to have the de facto discrimination against foreigners when they're applying for jobs, wants to ban the Islamic headscarf in public space, deport undocumented immigrants. So the far right is advancing, and I think that's one important thing to take into account. The other factor, as you were mentioning, is the low turnout. I mean, about 72% of the French electorate registered to vote turned out in this election. That's fairly high for American standards, but in the French context, it's very low. You have to go back to 1969 to find a participation level that was that low. Again, in 69, that was a matchup between two right-wing candidates as well, with no left-wing candidate. And even beyond the participation numbers, you also had people showing up at the polls, around 9%, who cast what are known as either blank ballots, so putting in blank pieces of paper into the envelopes that are then going in the voting box, or casting spoiled ballots, so crossing out names, writing someone else's name. 9% of people did spoiled ballots or blank ballots. And that's a really high number as well. So you have a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction. So at the end of the day, Macron's quote-unquote Republican front is holding. So this is the idea that people unite to vote against the far right. But there are clearly some signs of weakness. The far right's progressing. And the low turnout speaks to sort of the lack of interest, ultimately, in this election among a big chunk of the electorate.
So let me ask you about the sociology professor Daniel Zamora Vargas in France, who's argued President Macron is not a centrist, writing on a Twitter thread, Macron was, quote, the most right-wing president of the Fifth Republic. He created the conditions for the extreme right to be able to win the presidential election. Professor Vargas highlighted Macron's own support for anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim policies, saying Macron legitimated all the topics of the extreme right, adding, French people were forced to, quote, vote for Le Pen or vote for what created a favorable environment for Le Pen's ideas. It's a choice between an evil and the cause of that evil, said Vargas. His comments came after the first French presidential elections round of votes earlier in April.
Yeah, there's an expression in French that often was applied to this election, which is it's hard to choose between the plague or cholera. It's a French expression, and you heard it a lot going into the second round, having to choose between these two candidates. And if you look at the breakdown of Macron's support, around 40% of people who voted for Macron said that they voted for him to deny the presidency to Marine Le Pen. So that's a big chunk of voters that don't necessarily agree with his agenda. And in terms of his actual policies, again, it's in the French context, I think it's fair to say that, he has a very right-wing policy program that he's put into place. If you look at the repeal of the wealth tax that they used to apply to people with 1.3 million euros in assets, Macron did that in his very first budget as president, repealed the wealth tax. Put into place labor reforms to make it easier to lay off workers, recently embarked on reforms to the unemployment insurance system, which make it harder to have unemployment benefits. He's now talking about raising the retirement age to 65. So all these economic policies clearly put him in the right-wing camp, I think, in France. I think people call him a centrist. It's probably more accurate to say center-right or frankly, right-wing at this point. So on the socioeconomic spectrum, these policies, clearly right-wing. And then, as you mentioned as well, I mean, if you look at his policies around immigration, around policing issues, this is clearly someone who's moved to the right. And, his law on immigration that makes it easier to deport undocumented immigrants. We saw his law against Islamic separatism that a lot of human rights groups, including Amnesty International, denounced as going too far. We've also seen some of his government ministers, not necessarily Macron himself, but cabinet members go out and engage in sort of American-style culture wars, talking about wokeness, talking about the supposed threat of Islamo-leftists in the university system. All of this really meant to sort of play to a right-wing audience and really set the contours of the debate. Clearly on the right wing, and this gets back to why you had such high abstention, such low turnout in France, especially in the sort of working class immigrant communities that would be the most affected, arguably, by Le Pen coming to power. If you look at just the suburbs outside of Paris, so poor, relatively poor immigrant working class communities, very, very low turnout. And if you're in the Macron camp, I think you should be wondering, how is it that you can't get people like this to go out and vote against Le Pen? And it's because many people don't feel motivated, and some people, frankly, are struggling to see the difference between Macron and Le Pen. Clearly, French people voted; they decided to pick Macron over Le Pen. But you have an increasing swath of the electorate that is essentially saying, I'm not so sure the differences are that meaningful to warrant going out and voting for Macron. And again, I want to be careful because clearly he did get that support, but this sort of line, the sort of division that we've seen in the past between the center and the right, and then the far right, is really starting to fray. And I'm not sure how much longer it's going to be able to hold.
And then what role did this election taking place during Russia's invasion of Ukraine play? I mean, you have the New York Times writing, unable to get a loan. I mean, there was that famous ad that of Macron's where he rhymes Le Pen's name with Putin, and the New York Times writing, unable to get a loan from French banks. Ms. Le Pen and several of her top aides scrambled for cash in Russia, accepting a 9.4 million euro loan, then $12.2 million at a 6% interest rate from the first Czech Russian bank in September 2014. It was supposed to be repaid by 2019, and it hasn't been.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely horrible timing for Marine Le Pen. This is somebody who hasn't finished paying back a 9 million euro loan to a Russian bank in the midst of this increasingly authoritarian drift in Russia, in the midst of this horrible, brutal war that they've launched against Ukraine. And so Marine Le Pen has to somehow downplay her ties that, I should say, again, are not, this isn't speculation. There are financial ties linking Marine Le Pen and the far right to the Russian regime of Vladimir Putin. The bank that she took out a loan from was very close to the regime. And so this is horrible optics for Le Pen. She even had to edit out a National Front flyer that had her photographed shaking the hand of Vladimir Putin in 2017. And that issue really emerged during the one debate that we saw between the two rounds, in which Macron understandably went on the offensive about this issue, painting her as someone who was an apologist for Putin and actually owes money to Putin, and not so far-fetched of an argument, frankly. And it should be said as well. I mean, Marine Le Pen and the National Rally have looked to Russia and looked to Putin as a sort of model leader, someone who's a strong leader, who defends his country and his people, and. It should be said this time around in 2022, the National Rally Party actually went to Hungary to get their loan this time to finance the party, because they're struggling to get support in France, as you mentioned. So they took out a loan from Hungary, and Viktor Orban is another sort of model, a point of reference for Marine Le Pen and her party. And so clearly that factored into the election. It wasn't an important issue. The election really centered around what the French call pouvoir d'achat, purchasing power, cost of living, sort of bread and butter economic concerns. But certainly that issue came up in the debate, and it obviously did not help Marine Le Pen.
And then finally, the role of the far-right candidate, Eric Zemmour, and the left candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who came in third in the previous runoff, in the previous original election.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that right now French politics is essentially split into three blocks. You have the Macronist center-right neoliberal pro-business bloc that's won the presidency. You have a far-right bloc that is made up of Marine Le Pen, who is relatively more popular than Éric Zemmour, who's even more to the right of Le Pen. So you have this sort of far-right populist bloc, and then you have the left bloc, left populist, left-wing bloc, represented by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And I think this is where things could get really interesting as we look towards the legislative election. So rather than speculate about whether or not Macron might take into account left-wing voters this time or not, rather than speculate about his words, about the language he uses, what really counts are these legislative elections that are coming up in June, in which the left, for the first time in years, seems to be uniting, coalescing around a common program. We'll see how that pans out. But if they do that, there's a real chance to have a left-wing parliamentary majority that could then potentially block Macron from passing a lot of his laws and really have a significant impact over his next 5-year term. And for that matter, there's the risk also of the right coalescing and gaining support as well. So a very volatile situation that is really masked by the margin of victory, which seems big, but if you kind of scratch beneath the surface, we're in a very volatile situation. And the left, people counted out for years, finally seems to be coalescing. And I think that's going to be something to look out for when these legislative elections come up in June.
Well, Cole Stangler, I want to thank you for being with us. Paris-based journalist, writes for The Nation and Jacobin. We'll link to your articles. Next up, we go to Florida, where Republican Governor Ron DeSantis has signed into law a gerrymandered congressional voting map after pushing through the state's so-called Don't Say Gay law. We'll speak with Florida State Senator Chevron Jones, part of the state's legislative Black Caucus, and Florida's first openly gay state senator. We'll look at the Don't Say Gay law from Florida to Michigan to Missouri. Stay with us.